Breathe deep, acolyte. Taste the air of the throne world. It is not oxygen that fills your lungs, but the suffocating exhaust of 10,000 years of stagnant history. We walk the final approach to the Eternity Gate, and I want you to feel the sensory nightmare that surrounds us. The atmosphere here is thick, choking with the bitter stench of ozone from failing void shields, the cloying suffocation of burning myrrh, and the copper tang of vaporized blood. Every breath you take is heavy with the pulverized ash of martyrs whose names were forgotten millennia before you were born. Look upon the colossal statues that loom above us, their stone faces weeping black grime under the sheer gravity of an empire that has long since forgotten how to live. Strip away the gilded dogma they fed you in the Schola Progenium. I brought you here to the very nexus of humanity to see the terrible truth that lies beneath the incense and the scripture. The Imperium of man is not a glorious dominion rising eternally toward the light of salvation. It is a dying carcass. It is a bloated and festering corpse continually fed to a rotting god. We are nothing but the maggots writhing in the meat of a dead civilization, blindly pretending our frantic consumption is a divine purpose. Ahead of us lies the ultimate destination of every prayer in the galaxy, the Golden Throne. Do not dare to think of it as a machine, for that implies rationality and understanding. To the trillions of human souls scattered across the dark and freezing stars, it is an incomprehensible idol of absolute, terrified worship. They do not know of the esoteric archaeotech that sustains it, nor the irreplaceable cogs that grind themselves to dust within its abyssal depths. To the galaxy, the throne is a metaphysical altar demanding infinite sacrifice, a monolithic deity of brass, wire, and despair. Listen to the billions of pilgrims swarming the plaza behind us. Hear their screaming religious fanaticism, their desperate wails, their bodies willingly crushed under the feet of their own brethren, just to die within proximity of this holy epicenter. They flog themselves raw, bleeding upon the marble, begging for salvation from a mechanism they cannot begin to comprehend. Yet if you stand close enough to these massive adamantium doors, beneath the deafening roar of a trillion prayers, you will hear the unvarnished truth. There is only cold, silent horror waiting in the dark behind the gate. There is no loving father seated in the gloom, only a screaming psychic vortex tethered to a crumbling skeletal ruin. This is the apex of our species. This is the miserable terminus of all human endeavor. Look upon this absolute madness, acolyte. Let the horror of it wash away your innocence and ask yourself the question that has condemned better minds than ours to the pyres of the Inquisition. How did we arrive at this abyss of unending suffering? To answer this, we must cast our gaze backward through the choking mists of antiquity. We must return to an age when these hallowed halls were not lit by the flickering flames of fanaticism, but by the cold and unforgiving light of science. We must understand how a secular empire forged in the fires of pure reason devolved into a sprawling theocratic nightmare. Cast your mind back through the bleeding eons to the late 30th millennium. Before the nightmare of the present day drowned the galaxy in incense and dogma, there was a brief, shining age of rational hope. Out of the radioactive ashes of old Earth, the unification wars reached their brutal crescendo. The architect of this planetary conquest was no divine savior, despite what the screaming zealots of the modern ecclesiarchy would have you believe. He was an immortal perpetual, a being born of humanity yet separated from it by tens of thousands of years of hidden existence. Clad in auric armor and wielding psychic might that defied comprehension, he was a warlord of terrifying intellect. He did not ask for allegiance. He demanded compliance, subjugating tech barbarian warlords and gene witches under the absolute authority of his sword. He led from the front, a dynamic and physical conqueror carving a path of blood toward a secular utopia. With terror secured, his gaze turned outward to the cold void. This was the dawn of the Great Crusade. It was a galaxy-spanning ambition of unparalleled scale, an armada of unprecedented power unleashed to reclaim the scattered remnants of the human species. For 5,000 years, The diaspora of mankind had suffered in isolated ignorance, preyed upon by Xenos horrors and the terrors of the dark. The Emperor sought to bring them back into the fold of a single enlightened empire. Central to this grand reunification was his absolute and violent rejection of all religion. Faith was outlawed. Gods were declared a lie. This was the mandate of the imperial truth. It was not merely a philosophical preference for science and reason, but a masterstroke of cosmic warfare. The Emperor mandated a militant, aggressive atheism designed as a tactical weapon against the denizens of the immaterium. He understood that the entities of the warp fed upon the emotional resonance, the superstitions, and the blind worship of mortal souls. By systematically exterminating religion and enforcing strict rationalism across 1,000,000 worlds, he intended to starve the dark gods into powerlessness. It is the most bitter and tragic irony of our species that the man who burned churches and slaughtered priests to free humanity from the shackles of faith is now worshipped as the supreme deity of the most oppressive religious regime in history. Yet the Great Crusade, for all its glory and bloodshed, was not the true endgame. The compliance of the galaxy and the spread of the imperial truth were monumental achievements, but they were also a grand distraction. While his demigod sons and countless legions bled to push the borders of the Imperium ever outward, the Emperor kept his gaze fixed on a far more secretive goal. The outward expansion of humanity was merely a necessary smokescreen, buying time and resources for a much deeper, more vital objective hidden beneath the Imperial Palace. The Great Crusade was built upon a foundation of absolute, undeniable hypocrisy. The Emperor of mankind preached a secular truth, demanding logic and reason, yet the very engine of his conquest was fueled by witchcraft. Every expeditionary fleet relied upon the third eye of the navigator to pierce the cosmic dark. Every astropath was a psychic beacon, shrieking messages across the void. The Emperor used these mutants out of cold pragmatism, conquering the physical galaxy, while knowing full well that every psychic mind was a living, breathing gateway to hell. To understand this terror, one must understand the immaterium. Beneath the skin of real space lies the warp, a dimension forged entirely of raw, volatile emotion. It is a churning ocean where the collective fears, hatreds, and desires of every sentient species coalesce into terrifying reality. This realm is not empty. It is populated by predatory, sentient storms of nightmare that we call demons, ruled over by the unfathomable intelligences of the chaos gods. When a psyker draws upon their power, they tear a hole into this sea of madness, risking demonic possession and total annihilation. The master of mankind knew this truth better than any living soul. His greatest unspoken terror was that humanity was rapidly evolving into a psychic species. Without extreme control, this psychic awakening would inevitably trigger a cataclysm mirroring the fall of the Eldari, dragging the entire human race into eternal torment. The psychic mutation had to be chained. This dread culminated on the crystalline world of Nicaea. Deep within a massive, cavernous amphitheater carved from the heart of a dead volcano, the Emperor convened the greatest trial in imperial history. Before the assembled primarchs and the highest lords of the Imperium, he passed his unyielding judgment. The Emperor decreed an absolute ban on the use of psychic powers within the legions, outlawing all sorcery and ordering the immediate disbandment of the Space Marine Librarius. He stood before his sons as a stern, unyielding authoritarian, offering no explanations and sharing none of his deepest secrets. It was here that Magnus the Red, the Cyclops of Prospero, suffered his most agonizing defeat. Magnus was a being of dangerous curiosity and boundless arrogance, convinced he had mastered the perilous currents of the great ocean. To be publicly rebuked by his father was a humiliation that burned deep into his soul. He was told to look no further into the dark, but the Crimson King was entirely incapable of closing his psychic eye. Yet the Edict of Nicaea was merely a temporary bandage placed over a fatal, bleeding wound. the Emperor possessed a permanent solution to the psychic threat, a grand design that required him to abandon the front lines of the Great Crusade forever. Yet even as the lingering dread of the warp and the heavy shadows of forbidden sorcery darkened the fringes of the Great Crusade, the material realm burned with the blinding light of ultimate victory. On the vanquished world of Ulanor, the Imperium reached its absolute, glittering zenith. Behold the greatest gathering of martial might the galaxy had ever witnessed, a spectacle of such staggering scale that the very continents groaned beneath its weight. Hundreds of thousands of Adeptus Astartes stood in perfect, unbroken formations across a continent-spanning pavilion. Overhead, the sky was choked with the armored hulls of thousands of warships, eclipsing the sun in a display of unyielding dominance. At the center of this oceanic host stood the demigods themselves, the Primarchs, gathered in brotherly unity before the resplendent majesty of their father. It was a moment of unmatched glory, a testament to the manifest destiny of mankind. The galaxy, it seemed, was finally conquered. But it was here, at the very pinnacle of his triumph, that the master of mankind delivered a catastrophic blow to the hearts of his sons. Without warning, the Emperor abruptly relinquished his direct command of the Great Crusade. He bestowed the title of War Master upon Horus Lupercal, elevating his first-found son above his brothers and granting him absolute authority over the Imperial war machine. Then, the Emperor turned his back on the stars and departed for Terra. He offered no explanation. He left no comforting words of guidance. He simply abandoned his generals, his sons, at the edge of the galaxy. This profound abandonment sowed a bitter, ruinous harvest. Among the Primarchs, confusion swiftly curdled into deep resentment. Horus, though crowned with supreme authority, was quietly consumed by a dark pride and a gnawing doubt, harboring a bitter suspicion that his father had abandoned him to a lesser war. The sons bled for a galaxy their creator no longer seemed to care for. Far from the resentment of his neglected children, the Emperor plunged into the absolute depths of the throne world. Far below the towering gilded spires of the Imperial Palace, he descended into the Imperial Dungeon. This was a subterranean realm of unimaginable archaeotech and sterile, oppressive silence, entirely devoid of the warmth of humanity. Here, in the cold dark beneath the mountains, the master of mankind locked himself away. He surrounded himself not with his loyal sons, but with the greatest, most emotionless adepts of the Martian Mechanicum. Together, they labored tirelessly on a secret undertaking of staggering magnitude. The Emperor believed this colossal endeavor was the only true path to salvation, a masterstroke that would sever humanity from the predations of the Immaterium forever. He sacrificed the bonds of fatherhood for the survival of the species, completely unaware of the doom his silence had already orchestrated. In the lightless depths of Terra, the Emperor forged mankind's ultimate deliverance, trusting entirely in the vast subterranean machinery of his grandest and most dangerous design. Beneath the Imperial Palace, deep within the lightless vaults of Terra, lay the ultimate secret of the Great Crusade. The master of mankind had not abandoned his children to toil in the darkness out of apathy. He had descended into the dungeons to forge humanity's absolute salvation. This was the Imperial Webway project. It was an ambition of such staggering scale that it eclipsed even the conquest of 1 million physical worlds. The Emperor intended to completely sever mankind from its desperate reliance upon the warp. There would be no more risking entire fleets of souls to the predatory tides of the Immaterium. There would be no more dependency upon the mutant navigators or the fragile, screaming minds of astropaths. He would physically walk our species out of the nightmare of warp travel entirely. At the heart of this impossible endeavor sat the Golden Throne. It was not the gruesome torture device of endless suffering and psychic sacrifice that it is today. In its original magnificent design, it was a breathtaking triumph of arcane science and psychic engineering. The throne was a flawless interface forged to amplify and channel the sheer cosmic might of the Emperor. It acted as a transcendent psychic conduit, an arcane focal point built to harness godlike power. Through it, the Emperor could safely project his mind into the labyrinth dimension and carve newly constructed human tunnels into ancient Xenos architecture. He sat upon the seat at the absolute pinnacle of his intellect and psychic focus. He was delicately weaving impregnable shields of golden light to protect the nascent human pathways from the encroaching dark. To comprehend the magnitude of this triumph, one must understand the nature of the webway itself. It is a sprawling multi-dimensional network of interstitial arteries left behind by the ancient Eldari and their forgotten creators. Imagine calcified veins of solid reality running through the very chaotic heart of the warp. These hidden roads allow passage across the vast galaxy in mere moments rather than months. Most importantly, they are shielded from the ravenous demons that endlessly churn in the sea of souls outside. The webway is a hidden realm between realms where the ruinous powers hold no sway. The Emperor sought to hijack this ancient Xenos labyrinth and claim it as the ultimate birthright of mankind. The tragedy of this moment is a heavy cosmic weight that will forever crush the soul of our species. The Emperor stood upon the very precipice of securing humanity an eternal and inviolable ascendance. Through his unparalleled concentration, the new human sections of the webway were stabilizing. The psychic wards were holding against the raging, hateful tides of the immaterium. He was quietly ushering in an age where mankind would rule the stars completely untouched by the dark gods. Yet this masterpiece of psychic architecture was incredibly fragile. It required absolute precision and completely undisturbed isolation to solidify. The golden dream of a safe galaxy was practically real. It hung on the precipice of eternity, waiting only to be finalized. It was a flawless vision of salvation, completely unaware of the apocalyptic arrogance of a favored sun hurtling through the great ocean to shatter it forever. Far from the glittering spires of terror where the master of mankind labored in silence, the galaxy turned upon the edge of a poisoned blade. On the feral moon of Davin, the War Master Horus fell. Struck down by a weapon forged of pure warp malice, the greatest of the Primarchs lay dying, his transhuman physiology helpless against the unnatural rot of the Anathem. In his hour of supreme vulnerability, the architect of his ruin stepped from the shadows. First Chaplain Erebus of the Word-Bearers orchestrated a foul ritual within the Serpent Lodge, casting the spirit of Horus into the swirling madness of the Immaterium. There, the ruinous powers descended like vultures upon the soul of the War Master. They offered him a terrifying vision of a future yet to come. In these fever dreams, Horus saw a galaxy consumed by religious fanaticism, where his father was worshipped as a tyrant god, and the Primarchs who bled to build the Imperium were cast into absolute oblivion. It was a masterstroke of cosmic deceit. The dark gods showed Horus the exact, grim, dystopian nightmare that his own treason would inevitably create. Blinded by pride and gripped by the fear of obsolescence, the War Master broke his oaths. Horus renounced his father and pledged his immortal soul to the powers of darkness, cementing a pact that would drown the stars in blood. Yet this monumental betrayal did not go entirely unseen. Light years away upon the crystalline world of Prospero, the Crimson King stirred in his sanctum. Magnus the Red, sire of the Thousand Suns, possessed a psychic sight that pierced the darkest veils of the great ocean. Despite the absolute prohibitions of the Council of Nicaea, Magnus had cast his mind into the treacherous currents of the warp to keep watch over his beloved brother. Through the screaming tides of the ether, Magnus witnessed the tragedy on Davin unfold. He saw the serpentine lies of Erebus, the grasping claws of the Pantheon, and the tragic, willing fall of the War Master. Panic gripped the Cyclopean giant, but this dread was quickly overshadowed by his own fatal flaw. Magnus possessed an arrogant, unshakable certainty that his mastery of the warp was absolute. He believed himself superior to the psychic edicts of the Emperor, convinced that the great ocean was merely a tool to be wielded by an enlightened mind. In his boundless hubris, Magnus reasoned that only he possessed the knowledge required to save the Imperium from the creeping darkness. He would not trust astropathic choirs or void ships to carry a message of such apocalyptic magnitude. To thwart the rebellion of the War Master, Magnus decided he must speak directly to his father. He gathered his most potent sorcerers and prepared to shatter the boundaries of reality, blind to the catastrophic ruin his good intentions were about to unleash upon the galaxy. Driven by a desperation that defied the boundaries of the mortal coil, the soul of the Crimson King tore through the tempestuous tides of the Immaterium. He was a titanic entity of incandescent psychic energy, a blazing comet of sheer will fueled by the sacrificed lives of his master coven. Magnus hurtled across the galactic expanse, gaining terrifying speed and immeasurable power with every fractured second of his flight. His mind was fixed solely upon terror and the absolute necessity of warning his father of the War Master's treachery. Yet as his astral projection approached the throne world, he collided with a barrier of unimaginable majesty and absolute denial. This was no mere psychic shield formed of mortal thought. It was a staggering golden wall of shimmering adamantine force. These were the Emperor's own masterwork wards, woven to protect the secret construction of the human webway. Magnus struck the luminous barrier with the agonizing force of a dying star. The golden wall did not yield. His panic deepened as the terrifying realization dawned upon him. His father's protective labyrinth was entirely impenetrable to his unassisted might. He was trapped outside the gates of salvation while the galaxy burned behind him. It was in this moment of supreme and agonizing frustration that a presence manifested within the swirling madness of the warp. It appeared as a nameless, benevolent intelligence, a vast and sympathetic current residing within the ocean of souls. The architect of fate wore the mask of a friendly patron, whispering promises of deliverance into the mind of the desperate son. The entity offered the exhausted Primarch the exact measure of power required to breach the Golden Wall. Blinded by his own righteous intentions and fatally convinced of his ultimate mastery over the great ocean, Magnus accepted the poisoned gift. He drew the unfathomable chaotic power deeply into his spectral form. The soul of the Primarch swelled to a godlike magnitude that defied all sanity and reason. With a horrific surge of stolen omnipotence, the Lord of Prospero threw himself against the psychic defenses of terror. The moment of impact was a cataclysm of unprecedented cosmic violence. A deafening immaterial detonation tore through the foundational fabric of reality. The psychic shockwave echoed across every dimension of the warp and the material universe alike. The unbreachable wards of the Imperial Palace shattered like fragile crystal beneath a tectonic hammer blow. Within the deepest, most heavily shielded subterranean vaults beneath the Himalayan mountains, the physical backlash was absolute and instantaneous devastation. Miles of thick armor-glass observation panes exploded into millions of razor-sharp fragments. The delicate neural pathways of countless lobotomized servitors violently overloaded, their heads bursting in sudden wet blooms of crimson and bone. Tech priests and mortal laborers alike were thrown like broken dolls across the burning laboratories. The intricately woven, carefully constructed human extensions of the ancient webway groaned in agony before catastrophically fracturing. Reality itself screamed as the golden lattice of the Emperor's magnificent dream was violently torn asunder by the hands of his most gifted son. Where once stood an impregnable psychic defense against the horrors of the beyond, a ragged and bleeding wound was ripped open. The physical barriers between the material realm and the immaterium simply ceased to exist within the tunnels. The air within the Imperial sanctum grew freezing cold as the terrible scent of ozone and rotting blood began to rise. The psychic wards of the Imperial Palace did not merely fail, they shattered like a pane of glass struck by a macro-cannon. Down in the depths of the Imperial dungeon, the grand design of the Master of Mankind was instantly reduced to apocalyptic ruin. Magnus the Red had sought to deliver a warning of betrayal, but in his supreme arrogance, He had damned the very throne world he wished to save. The intricately woven aegis that protected Terra from the Immaterium was ripped asunder. Where there was once a shielded gateway into the human webway, there was now a howling abyss. The broken wards acted as a cosmic vacuum, violently sucking the raw, unadulterated stuff of the warp into the labyrinthine tunnels. The psychic pressure was unimaginable, crushing the minds of mortals who stood too close and turning the subterranean vaults into a slaughterhouse. Through the fractured wraithbone pathways of the ancient Eldari network, the Neverborn came pouring in. Demons of every abhorrent shape and horrific alignment flooded the breach in their billions. They rode the crest of the psychic backwash, eager to tear their way into the physical realm and feast upon the cradle of humanity. The Emperor of Mankind witnessed the destruction of his greatest work in a singular, terrifying heartbeat. The Master of Humanity knew instantly that if this demonic tide was not stemmed, Terra itself would be swallowed by the warp. In a desperate, agonizing moment of pure sacrifice, the visionary scientist was forced to become the eternal warden. He cast aside his grand ambitions for the psychic ascension of the human race and violently threw himself onto the seat of the Golden Throne. It was a mechanism designed to be guided by a willing, careful mind, not to be utilized as a crude psychic dam. As the Emperor forced his titanic will into the colossal machine, the physical toll was instantaneous and catastrophic. The throne was not meant to channel such a violent defensive surge of raw power. It immediately began to burn him. The Emperor grimaced in absolute, excruciating agony as the arcane circuitry seared his immortal flesh and tethered his soul to the crumbling gateway. He became a living linchpin, using his own unfathomable psychic might to hold the broken webway doors shut against the endless fury of the Pantheon. In that blinding flash of pain, the Emperor was imprisoned by his own creation. He was hopelessly trapped upon the agonizing seat, unable to rise, unable to command his legions, and unable to face the traitorous War Master who was even now rallying the galaxy against him. The Horus heresy had been revealed, yet the Emperor could do nothing to fight it in the stars above. To lift his focus for even a fraction of a second would mean the annihilation of Terra and the death of the human species. He was pinned in the dark, suffering a torment without end, while a sea of nightmares battered against the psychic walls of his mind. Yet the gate was only held, not sealed. The demonic horde still choked the tunnels beneath the palace, pressing ever closer to the golden doors. If the wards were to be restored, the infested tunnels had to be purged in the bloodiest of crucibles. A silent, secret war had to be waged in the shadowed depths of the webway, while the Emperor endured the burning agony of the throne. Though the Master of Mankind shackled his own mind to the Golden Throne to stem the bleeding of reality, the breach was simply too vast to be held by psychic might alone. He required blades in the dark. Thus the 10,000 marched beneath the earth. Alongside them walked the Sisters of Silence, the soulless null maidens whose very presence was anathema to the warp. Together they descended into the impossible geometry of the human webway. They crossed the threshold of the Imperial dungeon and stepped into a nightmare of fractured dimensions and mind-bending psychic tunnels. Here, hidden from the eyes of a galaxy tearing itself apart in treason, the true war for humanity began. It was a meat grinder of apocalyptic proportions. The Xenos paths were never meant to hold the weight of such savage, desperate slaughter. Behold the sheer, chilling pragmatism of the Master of Mankind. He had spent centuries crafting the Legio Custodes through peerless genetic alchemy to be his perfect companions, his artisans, and his philosophers. Yet without a moment of hesitation, he fed his finest creations into a subterranean abattoir. He traded the masterpieces of his genetic craft for time. Every second the custodians held the line was another second Terra survived. It was a cold, necessary equation, paid entirely in golden blood. For 5 unbroken years, this shadow war raged without pause, without reinforcement, and without the mercy of sleep. There was no glory to be found within the labyrinth. There were no remembrances to chronicle their deeds, no cheering mortal masses to witness their sacrifice. While the Horus heresy engulfed the stars above in loud, boastful displays of treachery, the Emperor's greatest warriors were being entirely consumed in a silent, pitch-black hole beneath the soil of their birth. They died by the thousands. The majestic golden guardians of the Imperial Palace were systematically reduced to exhausted, blood-soaked butchers. Their auramite armor was cracked and stained with the foul ichor of 1,000,000 banished nightmares. The Sisters of Silence fought and died with unspoken grace, their great swords severing demonic flesh and dissolving warp stuff into ash. Yet for every horror they destroyed, 10 more took its place. It was a realm where the laws of physics wept and collapsed, where the tide of the warp pressed relentlessly against failing psychic wards. The Custodians fought over shattered bridges of psycho-crystalline wraithbone, holding impossible choke points until they were buried beneath mountains of demonic dead. They did not complain. They did not falter. But even demigods possess a limit to the punishment they can endure. The endless, shrieking horde of the ruinous powers was a tide that could not be permanently pushed back by physical weapons, no matter how masterfully forged. As the long, agonizing years ground them down, the terrible truth of their situation crystallized within the dark. The line was breaking. The war within the webway was fundamentally unwinnable. The Golden Host was bleeding out in the shadows, and soon the dark tide would drown them all. For 5 agonizing years, the Golden Host of the 10,000 and the Silent Sisterhood held the line against the impossible. But the warp is an ocean without shores, and its abyssal tides are truly infinite. Colossal bloodthirsters, forged of liquid brass and boiling gore, battered against the unbroken shield walls of the Legio Custodes. Treacherous entities of shifting geometries and pure malice tore through the failing psychic barriers of the Mechanicus Adepts. The sheer weight of the Neverborn had grown too vast to repel. The Imperial forces were finally utterly overwhelmed. Through the screaming static of the Immaterium, the Master of Mankind issued an order that broke his very soul. He commanded the retreat. It was an agonizing surrender to the primordial annihilator. Battered, bleeding, and heavily depleted, the shattered remnants of the Emperor's peerless elite fell back through the ancient, humming archways. They dragged their wounded and their dead into the stifling metallic gloom of the Imperial dungeon. Behind them, the warp howled in unified triumph, hungry to devour the literal cradle of humanity. With a catastrophic surge of psychic might, the Emperor slammed the metaphysical door shut. The psychic concussion echoed across the Immaterium, blinding astropaths across the entire solar system. But the great warding seals of the gate had been shattered beyond any mortal repair. The lock was entirely broken. To understand the tragedy of this exact moment is to gaze into the darkest abyss of the imperial condition. The Golden Throne was never intended to be an instrument of perpetual torture. It was designed as the steering mechanism for a glorious new epoch of human enlightenment within the webway. Now that grand ambition was reduced to radioactive ashes. Because the ancient gateway lacked a functioning seal, the Emperor himself was forced to become the literal, living lock. His matchless intellect was chained violently to the unyielding machinery of the throne. His boundless mind was stretched across parallel dimensions, bearing the concentrated, crushing weight of a ruptured reality. If his divine concentration were to waver for a single microsecond, the portal would violently burst open. A second eye of terror would instantly tear into physical existence. It would swallow Holy Terror whole, plunging the throne world into the warp and condemning the entire human species to eternal demonic torment. He instantly became a silent prisoner within his own salvation engine. The Emperor could no longer walk among his loyal sons, nor could he draw his flaming sword to defend his physical realm. The magnificent dream of a peaceful psychic evolution for mankind officially died in the suffocating dark of the subterranean vaults. Only pure, desperate survival remained, and that survival would demand a price written in oceans of innocent blood. While the master of mankind burned endlessly upon his throne to hold back the infinite legions of hell from below, the physical universe above was rapidly darkening. The skies over the throne world were about to blacken with the suffocating shadow of treachery. The War Master's immense corrupted armada was finally tearing its way out of the warp and into the Sol system. The secret war for the webway was completely lost, and now the ultimate nightmare descended from the poisoned stars. The siege of terror was about to begin. The skies of terror turned black, choked by the bloated armada of the arch-traitor. The Horus heresy has finally reached the throne world, bringing with it an apocalypse of unimaginable scale. Billions of soldiers clash upon the holy soil, their blood forming vast oceans of slaughter. God machines of the Collegia Titanica scream their war horns, trading blows that shatter mountains and crack the planetary crust. Corrupting demonic rituals infect the very foundations of the Imperial Palace, twisting the earth into a nightmarish hellscape of warp-spawned horror. Amidst this unprecedented devastation, a singular question echoes through the minds of the desperate defenders. They ask why the master of mankind does not stride forth to smite the encroaching darkness. They beg to know why the godlike emperor of humanity remains hidden while allowing his magnificent dream to burn. The answer lies deep beneath the tectonic plates of terror, buried within the suffocating tension of the imperial dungeon. The emperor cannot move. He is shackled to the golden machinery of the throne, frozen in a state of absolute paralyzed duty. Beneath the palace, the ruined webway pulses with the infinite ravenous hatred of the warp. If the emperor were to rise from his seat for even a fraction of a second, the demonic horde tearing at the psychic wards would flood into the throne room. Terror would be consumed from within, and the defenders on the walls would be slaughtered from behind by a tide of unfettered nightmare. Thus, he sits in silent, perpetual agony. He is enduring a psychic torture so profound that it would obliterate the mind of a lesser god. Yet the physical torment is nothing compared to the tragedy of his omniscience. The emperor sees and feels everything. Through the blinding glare of the immaterium, he watches his loyal sons die in the mud. He feels the searing heat of his majestic palace burning to ash. He hears the terrified screams of countless innocent citizens being butchered by the monstrous entities his fallen son has unleashed. Every single death strikes his soul like a poisoned blade. He is drowning in the collective sorrow of a dying species. He possesses the power to obliterate entire traitor legions with a mere gesture, yet he is forbidden by cruel necessity from lifting a single finger. He must remain absolutely, perfectly still. Horus, swollen with the limitless power of the four chaos gods, continues to bombard the world from his flagship in the poisoned heavens. The War Master demands an audience of blood and ruin, baiting his father to abandon the wards and face him. The tension within the throne world reaches an unbearable precipice. The psychic weight of the siege threatens to crush the Emperor entirely, forcing a convergence of fate that cannot be ignored. The hour approaches where endurance alone will no longer suffice, and a final, desperate gamble must be cast into the void. The fires of the siege have consumed the very sky. The Eternity Gate, the final bulwark of mankind, buckles under a tide of unrelenting madness. Loyalist defenders fight upon mountains of their own dead. The blood of primarchs and the ashes of angels choke the steps of the Sanctum Imperialis. Annihilation is no longer a distant threat, but a creeping shadow clawing at the doors of the throne room. Then, across the screaming void of orbit, an impossible anomaly occurs. The void shields of the vengeful spirit, the flagship of the arch-traitor, suddenly fall. It is a deliberate lowering, a parting of the veil. Horus Lupercal has opened the door to his sanctum. The master of mankind knows instantly that it is a trap. Horus, now a bloated vessel for the ruinous powers, is inviting his father into the abyss. Yet the Emperor also knows it is the only remaining path. With the defenders breaking and terror fracturing to its core, a protracted siege can only end in the extinction of humanity. He must strike the serpent at its head. He must teleport to the vengeful spirit and slay his favored son. But a fatal paradox chains the Emperor to the earth. For years, he has not moved from the Golden Throne. He is not merely ruling an empire from that seat of arcane machinery. He is acting as the living seal upon a breached reality. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace lies the ruined Webway project, now a shattered artery bleeding the raw warp into the material realm. To sit upon the Golden Throne is to hold a collapsing mountain upon your shoulders. It is to endure the metaphysical weight of a torn dimension. Worse still, it is to face the focused, shrieking hatred of the four Chaos gods. Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh batter relentlessly against the psychic ward, desperate to flood terror with an ocean of demons. No normal mind can survive the interface of the throne. An ordinary psyker would be instantly vaporized, reduced to drifting ash by a fraction of the power surging through its golden conduits. Even a Primarch, save perhaps the Crimson King, who was designed for this very burden, would find their soul shredded within moments. If the Emperor rises to face Horus, the ward will fail. The portal will burst open, and terror will be swallowed into the immaterium before his teleportation flare even fades. The trap is perfectly forged. To win the war, the Emperor must leave the throne, but to leave the throne is to lose the homeworld instantly. Unless another soul takes his place, someone must sit upon the agonizing engine and hold the gate shut in the Emperor's absence. It requires a psyker of unfathomable willpower, a being willing to step into the flames of certain destruction. Only one mortal possesses the strength to bear the weight of the ruinous powers, even for a few desperate hours. To strike at the arch-traitor, the master of mankind had to leave the Golden Throne. Yet to abandon the psychic engine meant unleashing an apocalyptic tide of demons upon terror. Someone had to hold the gate closed. Only one soul possessed the sheer psychic might to endure the burden even for a few hours. That soul belonged to Malcador. Before the heresy, few understood the true nature of the frail, ancient man who stood always at the right hand of the Emperor. He was the regent of terror. He was the Grand Master of Assassins and the architect of the administrative imperium itself. More crucially, Malcador was a psyker of unfathomable, world-shattering power, perhaps the most potent mortal mind ever born, save for the Emperor himself. He was not merely a servant, but the Emperor's oldest and most deeply trusted friend. Now, that friendship demanded the ultimate sacrifice. The chamber fell into a dreadful silence as the ancient sigillite approached the massive, arcane machinery of the Golden Throne. He was a scholar, not a god, and his mortal frame was already withered by millennia of unrelenting toil. Yet his resolve was absolute, even as mortal terror gripped his heart. He looked upon the immense psychomechanical interface, knowing with absolute certainty that it would be his agonizing tomb. As Malcador seated himself and the colossal cables locked into his flesh, the horrific reality of the connection became manifest. The transition was instantaneous and deeply visceral. The unyielding cosmic weight of the warp crashed down upon his consciousness like an entire ocean collapsing onto a single grain of sand. His mortal flesh immediately began to smoke as raw, merciless psychic fire engulfed his mind. The sheer, unimaginable pressure forced a silent, ragged scream from his throat. His frail bones began to crack and splinter under the metaphysical strain of holding back the boundless, demonic fury of the immaterium. Blood wept from his eyes and ears, vaporizing into crimson mist against the superheated air. He was burning alive from the inside out, his soul acting as the single agonizing linchpin keeping the madness of the warp at bay. The Emperor watched his oldest companion embrace this unfathomable torment. A heavy, sorrowful heart weighed upon the master of mankind as he witnessed Malcador willingly feed his own soul to the roaring fires of the throne to save humanity. There was no time for lengthy farewells or lingering grief. The sigillite was buying his species a fleeting handful of hours with the currency of his own excruciating destruction. Wrapped in the agonizing inferno of his sacrifice, Malcador anchored the materium so that his sovereign might finally face the architect of their ruin. With the breach secured by the dying strength of his greatest servant, the Emperor gathered his strike force and cast his gaze upward toward the bleeding heavens. The final reckoning was no longer on the shattered surface of Terra, but waiting in the suffocating darkness of orbit aboard a corrupted flagship. While the sigillite burned upon the golden throne to buy humanity a handful of agonizing hours, the master of mankind stepped into the nightmare architecture of the vengeful spirit. He did not find his favored son waiting alone in the gloom. At the arch-traitor's feet lay the broken angelic form of Sanguinius, murdered for refusing the allure of chaos. Instead of the noble war master he once loved, the Emperor found only a bloated vessel of ruin, a champion swollen with the concentrated malice of the ruinous powers. Yet even as the psychic pressure of the warp threatened to crush the breath from his lungs, the Emperor hesitated. He looked upon the War Master and saw the echo of the brightest star of the Great Crusade, the beloved boy he had raised to conquer the stars. That lingering fragment of paternal love was a fatal vulnerability. Hoping against all reason that the arch-traitor could still be redeemed, the Emperor held back his limitless fury. Horus harbored no such mercy. The duel that followed was not merely a clash of talon and blade, but a catastrophic unraveling of reality itself. The War Master unleashed the primordial hatred of the Pantheon, battering the Emperor with a storm of world-ending violence. Flesh and golden armor sheared away under the merciless onslaught. Horus tore the Emperor's arm from its socket with a sickening wrench. A monstrous strike ruptured the Emperor's visage, ripping out a blazing eye and shattering the divine orbital bone. Finally, a calamitous blow crushed the Emperor's spine, bringing the master of mankind to his knees in a pool of his own sacred blood. As his physical form was butchered, the Emperor reached out with his mind, desperately searching for the soul of his son beneath the warp corruption. He found nothing. There was no Horus Lupercal left to save. The being before him was a hollow meat puppet, a necrotic shell piloted entirely by the laughing gods of chaos. The realization extinguished the last embers of the Emperor's paternal mercy. Sorrow hardened into absolute cold resolve. The Emperor gathered the entirety of his fading life force and marshaled his incomprehensible psychic might. He did not merely strike to end a biological life. He forged his mind into a blinding, unyielding lance of pure conceptual annihilation. When he drove that psychic spear into the War Master, he targeted the very essence of the traitor. The strike obliterated Horus utterly, burning away his soul in the immaterial realm and scattering his fundamental existence into less than ash. The Chaos Gods recoiled in sudden burning agony, denied forever the chance to resurrect their favored champion. Horus was undone, erased from the tapestry of existence, leaving behind only a lifeless carcass crashing to the blood-slicked deck. But the victory came at the ultimate cost. The master of mankind was now a mangled, bleeding ruin, his immortal flesh failing as he hovered on the absolute precipice of true death. The silence that followed the psychic detonation was deafening, broken only by the frantic footsteps of the Praetorian. Rogel Dawn wept as he beheld the shattered remains of his father, gathering the broken god into his arms to begin the desperate, blood-soaked race back to Terra. A sudden rupture of teleportation energies tore through the Stygian gloom of the Imperial dungeon. It was not a triumphant return. Out of the blinding flare stepped Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian of Terra, his armor scarred and weeping blood. In his massive arms, he cradled a ruin of flesh and golden armor. The master of mankind was shattered beyond the healing arts of any mortal age. A suffocating wave of despair struck the surviving Custodians and Mechanicum adepts. Wailing filled the cavernous chamber as the absolute devastation of the Emperor was laid bare. Dawn fell to his knees, his legendary stoicism breaking as he screamed for the apothecaries. Yet the true tragedy of the hour had yet to reach its zenith. High above the frantic throng, upon the burning apex of the Golden Throne, sat Malcador. The Regent of Terra was barely recognizable. He had endured unimaginable torment to keep the demonic tides at bay. his body reduced to a charred and desiccated husk. Sensing the return of his oldest friend, Malcador summoned the very last ember of his phenomenal willpower. With a silent cry of ultimate devotion, the sigillite relinquished his hold on the warp. His mortal shell violently immolated, collapsing into a drift of pale white ash that scattered across the dais. In that final fraction of a second, Malcador transferred his remaining essence into the dying emperor. It was a singular sacrificial gift of borrowed time. The emperor stirred, his ruined lips parting as a ghostly vitality animated his broken form. Dawn leaned close, tears carving through the soot on his face, to hear the final whispers of his gene-sire. The commands were gasping, agonized, and absolute. The emperor decreed that he must be permanently entombed upon the golden throne. He ordered the immediate construction of esoteric life support mechanisms to sustain his decaying biology indefinitely. This is the profound tragedy of the interment. The emperor possessed the biological mastery to perhaps heal, or the perpetual nature to resurrect if allowed to truly die. Yet he willingly sacrificed his own physical salvation to save the Imperium. If his life faded even for a moment, the broken webway gate beneath the palace would tear open, and terror would be swallowed by the warp. Furthermore, the Astronomican required his psychic might to guide humanity across the stars. Therefore, the Emperor chose a fate worse than death. He sentenced himself to an eternity of unyielding agony, becoming a rotting cyborg locked in constant psychic warfare against the ruinous powers. The tech priests descended like carrion birds, weaving their cables and invasive conduits into the divine flesh. The sarcophagus was sealed over the Emperor, severing him from the mortal universe. Dawn stood alone in the suffocating silence of the throne room, the last words of the Master of Mankind echoing in his mind as the heavy vault doors slowly ground shut. The Age of Hope was dead, buried beneath mountains of machinery and sorrow, leaving only a dark and terrible mechanism to endure the coming millennia. "10,000 years have ground the galaxy to dust since the closing of the Sanctum doors. The myth of the Great Crusade is dead. It has been buried beneath 10 millennia of stagnation, fanaticism, and endless war. We stand now in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Upon the raised dais of the Imperial Palace sits the Master of Mankind. He is no longer a living conqueror of stars. He is a silent, skeletal corpse. His shattered form is anchored to the precipice of life by the flickering hum of ancient stasis fields and the desperate prayers of trillions. The Imperium worships him blindly, venerating a god who never wished to be divine. The Golden Throne is a throne in name alone. It has grown like a metallic cancer into a grotesque, mountain-sized monstrosity. The elegant secular archaeotech of the 31st millennium has been completely subsumed by barbaric augmentations. It is now a jagged mountain of blackened cables, weeping coolants, and the suffocating weight of dark Gothic architecture. Vast heat sinks bleed toxic mists into the sanctum. These vapors cling to the towering statues of weeping angels and the petrified bones of ancient martyrs. Here, the divine and the profane are inextricably linked. Thick clouds of holy incense drift heavily through the stagnant air, yet this sacred perfume cannot mask the harsh chemical stench of ozone. It cannot hide the sickening tang of burnt meat and scorched bone. It is the scent of hyper-advanced technology rotting from the inside out. Endless ranks of crimson-robed tech priests scurry like insects across the monumental bulk of the machine. They chant Binharic litanies into the dark. They desperately apply sacred unguents to failing plasma relays and fractured crystalline power conduits. They do not understand the science of the engine they maintain. They merely repeat the dogmatic rituals handed down through the centuries. They are terrified that a single misstep will extinguish the last light of humanity. Mindless servitors hang suspended in rusted cranial jacks. Their pale flesh sloughs away as their remaining biological functions are drained to feed the voracious mechanisms of the dais. Standing vigil over this nightmare are the Adeptus Custodes. These golden guardians watch in solemn silence, They hold their guardian spears tight against shadows that never recede, forever protecting a king who cannot speak to them. To look upon this macabre engine is to witness the slow, agonizing death of a galactic empire. The Emperor suffers an eternal torture. His soul is tethered to a rotting physical anchor, while his mind wages a ceaseless war in the immaterial realm. One might ask why the High Lords allow such horror to continue. One might wonder why the Master of Mankind is denied the merciful peace of a true death. The answer lies in the terrifying necessity of the throne itself. This grotesque contraption of endless suffering does more than merely sustain a corpse. It is the bleeding heart of human space. It serves a secondary vital function that prevents the immediate extinction of our species. It provides the absolute foundation for a beacon of souls, projecting a blinding psychic fire into the void to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. To understand why the Master of Mankind endures such eternal torment, one must understand the absolute necessity of his suffering. The Imperium of Man spans 1,000,000 worlds, scattered across a galaxy of unfathomable vastness. To traverse this cold void, the ships of the Imperial Navy and the merchant fleets must plunge into the warp. This is a realm of pure nightmare, a churning ocean of psychic madness and predatory entities. To sail the Immaterium without a reference point is to invite certain oblivion. Mortal vessels would be struck blind by the chaotic currents, their hulls torn apart by warp storms, or devoured by the ravenous things that dwell in the dark. Humanity requires a guiding star to survive this abyss. It requires the Astronomican. The Astronomican is the Emperor's divine light made manifest. It is a blinding golden pillar of psychic resonance projected from holy terror, cutting through the roiling tempests of the Immaterium. It is the only true fixed point in a shifting universe of unreality. By locking their mutant inner eyes upon this brilliant lighthouse, the navigators of the Imperium can steer massive vessels safely through the tides of hell. Without it, the Imperium would shatter overnight, isolating countless worlds and leaving them to die alone in the darkness. Yet such a monumental beacon cannot be sustained by the physical shell of the Emperor alone. The psychic light requires fuel. High within the Himalayan peaks, dwarfed by the sprawl of the Imperial Palace, sits the Hollow Mountain. It is the fortress of the Adeptus Astronomica, a monastic order dedicated to a single terrible purpose. Within its cavernous, shielded depths resides the choir. 10,000 sanctioned psykers are gathered here, arranged in vast, tiered amphitheaters of humming brass and cold stone. They do not chant with physical voices. Instead, they sing a continuous, psychic hymn of pure devotion, their minds linked in a singular, overwhelming chorus. It is a song of ecstatic agony. The Emperor focuses this raw psychic chorus with his godlike will, shaping the chaotic energy and directing it out across the galaxy. But the conduit flows both ways, and the sheer, staggering magnitude of his presence is far too much for mortal minds to bear. The psykers of the choir are nothing more than human batteries, feeding their life force into the great machine. As they sing their silent song, the psychic friction slowly burns their minds to cinders. Their consciousness is consumed by the blinding radiance of the Master of Mankind. Their physical bodies wither, their synapses turn to ash, and their souls are immolated upon the altar of human survival. It is a slow, excruciating death, masked only by the terrifying euphoria of touching the divine. Over months of agonizing service, these sanctioned psykers are slowly drained completely, their lifeless husks eventually dragged away from the ampules to be replaced by fresh sacrifices. The light of the Astronomican must never fade, and so the fire must be continuously fed. This presents the Imperium with a monstrous logistical equation. To maintain the beacon and keep the realm of humanity united, the High Lords must harvest a ceaseless bounty of the very mutants they despise. The sprawling galaxy must be meticulously scoured for the witch, and a vast, terrible apparatus of collection must be deployed to reap this grim harvest. To feed this insatiable pyre, the galaxy must be constantly harvested. The demand for psychic flesh is absolute, a ravenous hunger that cannot be denied lest the Imperium shatter in the dark. Thus sails the League of Black Ships. They are the shadow that falls across 1,000,000 worlds, a fleet of ominous, silent leviathans that slip into planetary orbit without herald or warning. Their arrival enforces the Great Tithe, the most feared and despised exaction demanded by the master of mankind. Every planetary governor knows the cold dread of that midnight silhouette blocking out their stars. They must surrender their mutants, their witches, and their untutored seers. Every man, woman, and child who manifests even the slightest psychic mutation is rounded up by local enforcers and dragged away in chains. There is no appeal, no mercy, and absolutely no escape from the tithe. Yet the true terror of the Black Ships lies not in the pitch-black holds, but in the untouchable wardens who patrol them. These are the Sisters of Silence, the militant arm of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. They are blanks, genetic pariahs born with an abhorrent void where a human soul should reside. To a mundane citizen, their mere presence induces a nameless, creeping dread and a foul taste of ash in the mouth. To a psyker, they are a waking, suffocating nightmare. These soulless warriors project an aura of absolute anathema, a crushing weight of anti-reality that snuffs out the spark of the immaterium. They do not speak, communicating only in a complex sign language, for no spoken words could ever match the profound, unnatural emptiness they inflict upon the world. The journey back to the throne world is a voyage through hell itself. The captured psykers are violently herded into the deep, labyrinthine bellies of the Black Ships. They are sealed away in cold stasis crypts and heavy, psi-shielded isolation cells. Plunged into an endless, sensory-deprived darkness, they are forcibly cut off from the warp currents they once touched. Madness claims countless thousands before the immense vessels even break planetary orbit. The captives scream relentlessly in the dark, their voices echoing off cold iron bulkheads as they beg for a salvation that will never come. When the heavy cell doors slide open for inspection, the mere sight of their soulless jailers makes the psykers physically retch. They weep tears of blood as the null aura of the Sisters tears at the fundamental essence of their minds. It is an existence of pure, unadulterated agony, a calculated torment of the spirit designed solely to keep the highly volatile cargo suppressed. For subjective months or even years, these grim armadas navigate the treacherous tides of the warp. They are carrying holds full of shattered minds, broken bodies, and dying souls. Many perish in the pitch black, their frail physical forms entirely unable to endure the suffocating despair of the journey. Yet a sufficient number of the damned always survive long enough to see the pale, sickly light of Sul. The silent fleets finally tear their way out of the Empyrean, casting their impossibly long shadows across the orbital docks of Holy Terror. Here beneath the gaze of the palace, the screaming cargo is brutally unloaded into the vast holding pens. Here, the true culling is about to begin. Of the millions harvested by the Black Ships, only a fraction possessed the strength of will to serve the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, or burn as fuel within the Astronomican. For the weak, the unstable, and the dangerously untrained, a far darker purpose awaits beneath the golden crust of terror. These condemned souls are herded into the abyssal catacombs of the Imperial Palace, marching down into lightless depths where the scent of ozone and ancient blood clings heavy in the suffocating air. They are the chaff of humanity, yet they are the most vital resource in the galaxy. They are the daily bread of the master of mankind. Within the thrumming, cavernous chambers that house the deepest mechanisms of the Golden Throne, the true cost of human survival is laid bare. 1,000 psykers are brought forth each cycle, weeping and trembling, surrounded by the chanting priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the silent, towering custodians of the Emperor. There is no mercy to be found in these sacred vaults, only the cold, industrialized machinery of survival. The victims are stripped of their dignity and bound into black, coffin-like sarcophagi that line the colossal subterranean walls. Thick cables, pulsing with archaic energies, are driven into their flesh and wired directly to the base of the Golden Throne. When the great machines awaken, the horror truly begins. It is not a swift or gentle death. The arcane engines activate with a deafening roar, violently tearing the life force from the shackled psykers. Their living souls are dragged screaming from their physical vessels, drawn up through ancient conduits to feed the starving god at the center of the web. Agony beyond mortal comprehension courses through them as their essence is slowly atomized, burned away to sustain the rotting physical husk of the Emperor. Flesh withers to ash, eyes boil in their sockets, and minds shatter under the sheer psychic gravity of the being they are forced to sustain. This atrocity is not an aberration, but a holy sacrament meticulously repeated cycle after cycle without pause. 1,000 souls are sacrificed every single day, their lives extinguished to buy the Imperium another rotation of the sun. For 10 millennia, this blood tithe has never ceased, accumulating a death toll so staggering it defies the boundaries of sanity. The Imperium does not view this as slaughter, but as the ultimate martyrdom, the highest honor a wretched mutant could ever hope to achieve. Yet as the centuries grind into millennia, one must question the nature of the entity sustained by this endless river of suffering. If a being consumes 1,000 screaming souls every day for 10,000 years, breathing in their terror, their pain, and their final moments of absolute despair, one must ask what becomes of that being. The psychic echoes of billions of slaughtered innocents now course through the Emperor's withered veins, begging the terrifying question of what this endless diet of agony has done to the divine mind. To gaze upon the rusted, blood-stained mechanics of the Golden Throne is to see only the outer shell of a cosmic cage. The true horror lies within the mind of the prisoner. It is a comforting heresy of the ignorant masses to believe the master of mankind slumbers, dreaming of a better age while his physical form heals. The Emperor does not sleep. He has not known a single moment of rest in 10,000 years. Instead, his existence is an unending waking nightmare of galactic scale. Over 10 millennia of ceaseless torment, the Emperor's once singular intellect has been violently shattered. His consciousness is now splintered into millions of screaming, warring fragments, spread infinitely thin across the treacherous currents of the immaterium. At any given second, a fraction of his shattered mind is locked in a desperate, endless melee against the boundless malice of the four chaos gods. He battles these primordial horrors relentlessly, holding closed the warp rifts that would otherwise consume holy terror in a tide of demons. Simultaneously, another splinter of his fractured awareness reaches across the galaxy, subtly guiding the desperate actions of trillions of his subjects through the shifting portents of the Imperial Tarot. Yet another fragment channels his raw, burning essence to ignite the Astronomican, the solitary psychic lighthouse guiding humanity through the absolute dark. And through it all, every single day, he must endure the agonizing psychic death screams of 1,000 sacrificed psykers. He feels their terror as their souls burn to ash within his own mind, devoured to sustain his failing power. Do not mistake this entity for the man he once was. The rational, enlightened scientist who walked the halls of the 30th millennium is dead, burned away by the fires of unending duty and unimaginable pain. What remains upon the throne is a localized god of the warp, an entity of pure, unadulterated terror. He has become a vast, cold, unfeeling psychic storm of pure agony, wrath, and Xenos majesty. His humanity has been scoured away entirely. He has been replaced by a presence so profoundly incomprehensible that it defies all mortal reason. To look upon the true landscape of his mind in the 41st millennium is to invite instant, violent insanity. Even the most fortified psychic inquisitor would find their soul immediately shredded by the sheer, crushing weight of his unending suffering and tyrannical will. He is no longer a father to his people. He is a cosmic predator of necessity, a monument to sacrifice so absolute that it has warped his very nature into something monstrous. This is the agonizing reality of the imperial truth. The savior of the human race exists in a state of perpetual crucifixion. a fractured deity screaming into the void of the immaterium to keep the darkness at bay. And the most terrifying truth of all is not the torment he endures, nor the monstrous entity he has been forced to become. The ultimate horror is that this eternity of absolute suffering is the optimal outcome for the human race. This nightmare is the best-case scenario. And the flickering mechanisms of the Golden Throne weep with the evidence that even this unbearable compromise is beginning to fail. We approach the closing days of the 41st millennium. The delicate equilibrium that has held the Imperium together for 10,000 years is unraveling. In the suffocating gloom of the Imperial Palace, the most terrifying truth in the galaxy can no longer be ignored. The Golden Throne is dying. It does not fail all at once, but rather in a creeping crescendo of subtle, impossible anomalies. Deep within the Sanctum Sanctorum, mindless maintenance servitors suddenly freeze or spasm in violent malfunctions. Localized grav plating, ancient and reliable, flickers and drops out of sync, sending attendants plummeting into the abyssal shafts. Worse still are the microscopic fractures webbing across the auramite housing of the archaic power shrines. These are fatal flaws that no augur can predict and no artisan can seal. The machinery of salvation is groaning under the weight of 10 millennia. Then comes the ultimate, unspeakable horror. For 100 centuries, the daily tithe of 1,000 psyker souls has been enough to sustain the master of mankind. But as the year 999 M41 approaches its bitter end, the black ships must yield more. 4 times that number are now required to feed the fading spark, a staggering escalation of the blood tithe. The astropathic choirs whisper that the hunger of the throne is growing, demanding an ever-increasing harvest just to keep the Astronomican burning. This truth breeds an existential dread that paralyzes the highest echelons of terror. The High Lords huddle in their shielded chambers, suffocating beneath the weight of a doom they cannot legislate away. Even the Adeptus Custodes, the unwavering golden guardians of the throne room, feel the icy grip of a dread they were never engineered to experience. The impossible is happening right before their eyes, and sheer panic threatens to shatter the ruling castes of humanity. To understand their absolute despair, one must comprehend the true nature of the Golden Throne. It is not merely a machine, but an irreplaceable relic of incomparable complexity. It predates the Imperium itself, a sprawling monstrosity cobbled together from the lost miracles of the dark age of technology. Whispers persist that the Emperor even integrated forbidden Xenos components into its core architecture to amplify its psychic resonance. The throne is entirely unique. There are no ancient blueprints, no sacred texts, and no living minds that comprehend its fundamental design. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years merely tending to a colossal engine it does not understand. They are primitive caretakers, blindly anointing a dying god of steel and wire with holy oils. Every failing relay and every shattered conduit pushes humanity closer to the ultimate abyss. Eyes now turn in desperation toward Mars, seeking salvation from the priesthood of technology. Yet beneath their crimson robes, the highest lords of the cult Mechanicus harbor a secret, humiliating terror of their own. Across the toxic dunes of Mars, the grandest forges fell into a terrifying, secretive silence. The Fabricator General convened frantic, clandestine conclaves of the highest magi, severing entirely the local noospheric networks to contain the panic spreading through the broader priesthood. These chosen custodians of the Omnissiah had been summoned to mend the wounded heart of the Imperium. Yet beneath their crimson robes and heavy cybernetic augmentations, these supposed masters of the machine were completely paralyzed by an overwhelming religious dread. The tech priests approached the Golden Throne not as rational mechanics diagnosing a damaged engine, but as terrified acolytes prostrating themselves before the altar of a dying god. They bathed the esoteric circuitry in sacred unguents and flooded the throne room with thick clouds of sanctified incense. They chanted desperate binary litanies of appeasement to calm what they believed to be agitated machine spirits. But religious reverence is a tragically poor substitute for actual comprehension. Their absolute, terrifying ignorance of the throne's true physical mechanisms laid bare the grand, decaying tragedy of our age. When the highest-ranking magi finally dared to initiate holy diagnostics, bridging their own delicate neural architecture with the peripheral auramite conduits, the results were instantly maddening. The great machine forcefully spat back cascades of incomprehensible data that shattered their logical processes. Error logs manifested in dead, forgotten tongues and wildly corrupted code that physically burned the optic nerves of the attending lex mechanics. The throne did not speak the ritualized, stagnant binharic of the current epoch. It screamed in the foundational mathematics of a long-dead golden age, its desperate warnings entirely untranslatable to the weeping priests who begged for its salvation. Here lies the darkest, most pathetic truth of the 41st millennium. Humanity has entirely forgotten the fundamental power of science. The Adeptus Mechanicus operates exclusively on rigid rote memorization and blind, dogmatic faith. They meticulously preserve the outer shell of ancient technology, while the underlying physics remain an impenetrable, terrifying mystery to them. They are nothing more than primitive shamans frantically anointing with sacred unguents and singing binary litanies at the core of a critically melting plasma reactor. They cannot restore the Golden Throne, for they lack the fundamental cognitive framework required to comprehend the staggering dimensional architecture that birthed it. The Emperor and his deepest technological secrets belong to a glorious era of rational enlightenment that has been systematically ground into dust by millennia of oppressive dogma. Their frantic rituals and anointing oils achieved absolutely nothing but a microscopic delay of the inevitable doom. The esoteric alloys deep within the machinery continued to fracture, and the massive psychic baffles wept with unseen structural tears. The priesthood could only watch in crushing intellectual inadequacy as the warp pressure within the immaterium mounted against the fragile physical wards. Their blind faith offered no actual shield against the cold, cosmic reality of a rapidly failing mechanism. Soon, the entire galaxy would be forced to witness the ultimate catastrophic consequence of this profound ignorance, when the great machine would finally stutter, just as the fabric of reality was torn completely asunder. The tech priests of Mars were already drowning in the failing holy mathematics of the Golden Throne when the final doom arrived. It did not come as a mechanical failure, but as a cosmic slaughter. Cardia, the eternal gatekeeper, broke beneath the fury of the despoiler. The planet cracked, and with its shattering, the veil between reality and the Empyrean was torn to shreds. The Cicatrix Maledicta, the great rift, violently tore its way across the stars. It was a wound of madness that physically and spiritually bifurcated the galaxy. A scream of raw, bleeding warp energy erupted from the Eye of Terror, rushing outward with cataclysmic speed. When this psychic shockwave struck Terra, the unimaginable occurred. The choir of the Astronomican, the guiding light of humanity for 10 millennia, shrieked in unison and fell utterly silent. The beacon flickered, choked on the sudden tidal wave of raw chaos, and died. Thus began the era whispered of only in nightmares, known as the Noctis Aeterna. In an instant, the Imperium was plunged into an absolute suffocating dark. Across the galaxy, millions of void ships navigating the currents of the Immaterium were suddenly stripped of their guiding star. Navigators burned from the inside out, their third eyes bursting as the warp raged out of control. Geller fields collapsed under the pressure of the unchained storm. Countless armadas carrying billions of souls were instantly devoured by waiting tides of demonic entities. There was no battle, only the butchery of the blind. Yet the terror was not confined to the deep void. On Terra itself, the cradle of mankind tasted the bitter ash of the end of days. The psychic shockwave was so absolute that the Emperor's divine presence seemed to wane, his protective aegis faltering under the weight of the cosmic wound. For the first time since the Siege of Terra, The unthinkable became reality. The veil shattered upon the throne world, and a cataclysmic demonic invasion spearheaded by 88 legions of Khorne erupted right at the Lion's Gate, staining the very steps of the Imperial Palace with warp-spawned gore. Bloodthirsters and their crimson kin slaughtered indiscriminately, painting the sacred avenues with the gore of pilgrims and scribes. The Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence fought a desperate, bloody war to hold the sanctum against an enemy that spilled directly from the nightmares of men. The entire species stood on the precipice of absolute annihilation. Every world was isolated, completely cut off from the light of the Master of Mankind, waiting for a dawn that seemed as though it would never break. Eventually, through the sacrifice of thousands of psykers and the sheer indomitable will of the Emperor, the Astronomican sparked back to life. The light returned, banishing the shadows from the steps of the palace, but the damage to the Imperium was irreversible. The trauma of the blackout and the horrifying proof of Terra's vulnerability laid bare a terrifying truth. The Golden Throne could not withstand another shock of such magnitude. This terrifying revelation left the Lords of the Mechanicus with only one desperate path forward. Driven by the existential dread of permanent darkness, the masters of the machine cult prepared to embrace a solution so radical, so profoundly forbidden, that it threatened to tear their entire priesthood apart. The dying echoes of the Astronomican left behind a terror so absolute that it shattered the foundational dogmas of the Imperium. Faced with the encroaching dark, the highest echelons of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Inquisition embraced an unthinkable heresy. They who had spent millennia feeding billions to the fires of puritanical zeal now turned their faces from the blinding light of terror. A clandestine expedition was assembled in the deepest shadows of the Sol system. Radical tech priests, their logic engines overridden by sheer desperation, joined forces with the shadow lords of the Ordo Xenos. These were the very inquisitors who had built empires of ash, screaming that the Xenos must not be suffered to live. Yet as the Golden Throne faltered, their righteous fury evaporated into pathetic hypocrisy. They stripped away their pride and prepared to crawl into the darkest abyss of the cosmos, ready to beg for salvation from the galaxy's most depraved monsters. Their destination was not a world bound by the laws of real space, but a parasitic realm hidden deep within the labyrinthine arteries of the webway. They set their cursed course for Comarach, the dark city of the Drukhari. It is a monstrous, impossible metropolis built upon the concentrated suffering of countless trillions. To enter the jagged maw of Comarach is to willingly cast one's own soul into a cosmic grinder of endless sadism. But these desperate pilgrims did not seek the arrogant archons who rule the high spires, nor the blood-slicked witch cults of the gladiatorial arenas. They sought the supreme lords of the Undercity, the architects of atrocity known as the Homunculi. To understand the Homunculi is to look into the abyss of an age long before the fall of the Eldar Empire. They are ancient and twisted beings who have conquered death itself through the meticulous application of absolute agony. They are peerless flesh sculptors and the undisputed masters of esoteric pain technology. Where the Adeptus Mechanicus builds clumsy machines from iron and sanctified oils, the Homunculi forge technological miracles from screaming nervous systems, harvested organs, and shattered souls. They possess a sickening mastery over biology that borders on the divine, a dark science perfected over millions of years of unfettered experimentation. It was to these vile monstrosities that the proud lords of humanity now offered their ultimate supplication. The expedition navigated the treacherous shadow paths, guided by captured Xenos corsairs and forbidden star charts. They descended into the stinking oubliettes of the Dark City, their purity seals peeling and cracking in the spiritually suffocating atmosphere of the sub-realms. The radical envoys offered forbidden knowledge, the lives of entire planetary populations, and priceless imperial relics just to buy a fleeting audience with the Covens. They sought to repair the failing mechanisms of the Golden Throne using Xenos alchemy that fed exclusively on raw agony. Slowly, the flayed-skin doors of the flesh laboratories ground open to receive them, welcoming the desperate humans into a nightmare that would forever taint the destiny of mankind. In the flesh pits of the Dark City, the proud lords of terror were forced to their knees. Before them floated the grotesque majesty of a master homunculus, a vile architect of flesh from the deepest covens of the Dark City. The ancient Xenos looked upon the Imperial envoys not with hatred, but with a cold and terrifying amusement. To him, these desperate humans were nothing but vermin, yet vermin that carried the most exquisite scent of despair. The Mon-K had come to the architects of suffering to beg for salvation. The ancient homunculus savoured their humiliation, dragging out the negotiations over cycles of torment and psychological ruin. Eventually, a twisted pact was struck in the shadows. The Dark Kindred would cast their vile expertise upon the failing mechanisms of the Golden Throne. In exchange, the Imperium would pay a price that defied all sanity. Entire generations of Imperial subjects, untainted genetic stock, and arcane technologies from the forbidden vaults of the Sol system were bartered away. The envoys signed away the souls of billions to buy a sliver of hope, shattering their own humanity in the process. The sheer cosmic dread of this arrangement stood as a monument to humanity's absolute desperation. The Imperium of Man, founded upon the absolute extermination of the Xenos, had invited the galaxy's most depraved sadists into its holiest sanctum. They had granted creatures of pure, unadulterated malice the right to perceive the life support system of the God Emperor himself. To allow a homunculus to study the throne is to let a parasite feast upon the dying heart of mankind. When the abhorrent homunculus finally turned its horrific senses toward the arcane machinery holding the Emperor between life and death, it did not find a noble artifact of preservation. Through their twisted eyes they saw the Golden Throne for what it truly had become over 10 millennia. It was a mechanism fueled by the burning of psyker souls, a construct that sustained a corpse through an unending cycle of agony. The homunculi realized that the throne was essentially a pain engine of unparalleled glorious scale. It was a masterpiece of suffering that even the masters of Comera could scarcely comprehend. They were deeply intrigued, captivated by the sheer volume of torment channeled through the ancient psychic circuitry. But they offered no salvation. The Xenos savants did not repair the failing systems, nor did they possess any true desire to save the master of mankind. They merely observed, studied, and extracted the secrets of human misery for their own sick gratification. The vile pact inevitably shattered in betrayal and bloodshed, leaving the ancient mechanisms just as degraded as before. The Imperial envoys were left morally bankrupt, their souls stained forever by the darkest heresy imaginable. They had sacrificed worlds, traded the lives of the innocent to absolute monsters, and achieved absolutely nothing. The realization crashed down upon the High Lords like an executioner's blade. The twisted pact had failed, and the grand machine that anchored the Imperium was slipping beyond the reach of any science, human or Xenos. The relentless decay of the Emperor's cradle could no longer be denied, forcing humanity to gaze into the terrifying abyss of what awaits when the machinery finally groans to a halt. We have exhausted our desperate remedies, leaving us to face the ultimate terrifying question. What happens on the day the ancient mechanisms finally grind to a halt and the Golden Throne fails? To understand the end of all things, we must first look to the immediate physical reality beneath the Imperial Palace. For 10,000 years, the Master of Mankind has not merely functioned as the beacon of the Astronomican, but acted as a living, agonizing seal. Deep beneath the Sanctum Imperialis lies the ruined Imperial Webway, a shattered and corrupted gateway directly into the Immaterium. Behind that sealed portal, an ocean of unholy malice has battered against the Emperor's psychic wards without a single second of respite since the dying days of the Horus heresy. Billions of demons, the endless screaming legions of the ruinous powers, wait in the churning darkness for a single moment of weakness. If the Emperor's physical form perishes, his psychic lock will instantly evaporate. The golden barrier will shatter into nothingness. A tidal wave of unfettered nightmare will flood the Imperial dungeon in a matter of seconds. The Custodian Guard, for all their peerless martial perfection and genetic majesty, would be swept away like dust before a torrential hurricane. Within hours, the throne world would be utterly consumed by the denizens of the warp. The holiest ground in the galaxy would become a slaughterhouse of unparalleled scale, drowning billions of pilgrims, scribes and soldiers in a frenzy of blood and madness. Yet the sheer physical devastation of holy terror is only the genesis of the catastrophe. We must consider the immense metaphysical weight of our capital world. Terror is the absolute psychic fulcrum of the entire human species. It is utterly saturated with the desperate prayers of countless trillions, steeped in the concentrated fanatical faith of 10 millennia, and deeply scarred by ancient overlapping warp anomalies. When the Emperor dies and the demonic incursion reaches its zenith, the battered fabric of reality itself will be completely unable to withstand the catastrophic pressure. The thin membrane between the material universe and the Sea of Souls will entirely dissolve. A new eye of terror will tear itself violently open right in the heart of the segmentum solar. This newborn abyssal rift would instantly swallow the entire Sol system, obliterating our ancestral home and extinguishing the guiding light of the Astronomican forever. The Imperium of man would be instantly severed, plunged into total blinding darkness. Every human world would be isolated, cut off from navigation and reinforcement, left to be devoured piece by the laughing thirst of the dark gods. Mankind would not simply be defeated, but completely erased from the tapestry of existence, our very souls cast into a howling abyss of eternal, agonizing torment. It is a doomsday scenario so absolute and uncompromising that the mortal mind instinctively recoils from its contemplation. We are staring into the maw of a true apocalypse, where the death of one god means the damnation of our entire species. But the master of mankind, in his infinite and terrifying foresight, did not turn his gaze away from this ultimate nightmare. Even as his ruined body was being interred upon the throne, he understood that terror might one day face this horrific inevitability, and he prepared a grim sanction to ensure the cradle of humanity would never become a demon world. Yet the master of mankind was no naive architect of idle dreams. He knew that should his mortal shell perish, the demonic tides screaming through the breached webway would not merely consume the Imperial Palace, but claim the very soul of the human species. To prevent the ruinous powers from ever planting their profane banners upon the ashes of humanity's cradle, the Emperor conceived a final, terrible contingency. It was a masterstroke of ruthless, cold-blooded pragmatism, a secret kept entirely hidden from the Lords of Terror and almost all of his own genetic sons. This was the ultimate denial, a supreme act of spite aimed at the dark pantheon of the warp. To construct this instrument of absolute annihilation, the Emperor called upon Vulcan, the Lord of Drakes and Primarch of the Salamanders. Of all the demigods forged in the gene laboratories of terror, Vulcan possessed the greatest compassion, known universally as the stalwart protector of the weak and a master smith of unparalleled intuitive genius. It remains a bitter testament to the Emperor's grim design that the most humane of his sons was burdened with the duty of crafting the instrument of humanity's total cremation. Guided by the Emperor's psychic commands, Vulcan descended into the deepest, most heavily warded subcrypts beneath the Imperial dungeon, far below the desperate siege above. There, amidst the screaming machinery of the failing webway gate, the Primarch labored in agonizing secret. Vulcan integrated the artifact he had carried across the stars, an apocalyptic failsafe known as the Talisman of Seven Hammers. It was a marvel of forbidden archaeotech, a world-cracking superweapon interwoven seamlessly into the unfathomable, continent-spanning circuits of the Golden Throne. The talisman was not designed to repel an invasion, nor was it meant to seal the demonic breach that bled reality dry. It was constructed purely as a cosmic dead man's switch. The firing mechanism of this doomsday device was tied inexorably to the biological and psychic life signs of the master of mankind. It listens eternally to the fading rhythm of the Emperor's shattered heart. Should that singular divine heartbeat ever cease, the talisman of 7 hammers will activate in a fraction of a microsecond. It will not merely detonate the Imperial Palace or scorch the atmosphere. The ensuing chain reaction will ignite a cataclysm of unbound alchemical fire that will instantly shatter the tectonic crust of Holy Terror itself. This cleansing inferno is designed to expand outward with unimaginable stellar fury, consuming the sacred Martian forge rings, boiling away the oceans of Titan, and vaporizing the entirety of the Sol system. Every monument to mankind's glory, every living soul on the throne world, and every archive of human history will be rendered into radioactive cosmic dust. Chaos would inherit absolutely nothing but drifting ash and the hollow, mocking silence of a dead star. The true cradle of the species would be forever denied to the dark gods, burned away in an act of unapologetic, supreme sacrifice. But this ultimate solar conflagration would merely be the blinding flash preceding an even deeper dark. The immolation of the Sol system carries a cosmic cost far greater than the loss of humanity's ancestral home. As the flames of the talisman prepare to consume the throne world, a far more devastating silence waits to fall across the million worlds of the struggling Imperium. The fires of the talisman consume the cradle of humanity. As terror burns, the golden beacon of the Astronomican gutters out for the final time. There is no grand explosion across the cosmos, only a suffocating, absolute dark. Across a million worlds, the astropathic choirs scream in unison as the Emperor's light vanishes from the immaterium. Then, there is only silence. The great psychic network that bound the Imperium together is instantly severed. Navigators, those three-eyed mutants who steered the gargantuan vessels of the Imperial Navy, suddenly find themselves staring into a churning, lightless abyss. Countless fleets are instantly swallowed by the warp, their crews condemned to eternities of madness and torment at the hands of the Neverborn. Warp travel becomes virtually impossible. The galaxy is no longer a vast, interconnected empire, but a scattering of isolated islands marooned in a sea of nightmares. The consequences are immediate and catastrophic. Hive worlds, towering megalopolises entirely dependent on regular shipments from distant agri-worlds, spiral into total starvation within weeks. Billions resort to cannibalism in the suffocating darkness of the underhives. Without the limitless manpower of the Astra Militarum or the rapid strike forces of the Adeptus Astartes, the predators of the galaxy feast. Tendrils of the tyrannid hive fleets, drawn no longer by the golden beacon of terror but by the scent of undefended meat, devour entire sectors unopposed. Great orc wars cascade through the stars without a unified imperial resistance to break their momentum, reducing civilized worlds to primitive slaughterhouses. The Imperium shatters into a million tiny, terrified pockets of humanity, each one waiting alone in the dark to be slaughtered. This is the age of strife reborn. The most paranoid prognosticators of the Ordo Hereticus look upon this theoretical future and recognize the shadow of old night. Yet this tragedy is profoundly different from the cataclysm that birthed the Imperium. During the first age of strife, humanity possessed the scattered remnants of Golden Age technology and the latent vigor of a species waiting for its savior. Now, 10,000 years of ceaseless warfare and bureaucratic decay have bled humanity dry. The species is exhausted, entirely dependent on the monolithic structure of the Adeptus Terra to simply exist. Without the Emperor, there is no strength left to survive a second old night. The Xenos, the mutant, and the heretic will simply wipe the slate clean. Yet even as the ultimate darkness descends upon a severed galaxy, a twisted echo of faith refuses to die entirely. In the deepest shadows of this fractured reality, certain radical sects do not weep for the burned throne world. Instead, they look to the ashes of terror and whisper that the Emperor's death was not a defeat, but a necessary sacrifice to unshackle a god. Amidst the rotting foundations of the Imperium, where orthodox minds see only an impending apocalypse, others dare to behold a dark salvation. In the deepest shadows of the Inquisition, radical factions such as the Illuminati whisper a truth so heretical it burns the lips that speak it. They look upon the decaying husk upon the golden throne and do not see a dying monarch. They see a chrysalis. These desperate scholars, alongside radical resurrectionist cults hidden within the Inquisition itself, champion the forbidden doctrine of the Star Child. To these radicals, the Golden Throne is no longer a miraculous engine of preservation. It is a torturous prison of arcane machinery, binding a limitless and evolving soul to a rotting cage of meat and bone. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has been anchored to the mortal plane against the natural order of ascension. In that endless, agonizing span, his psychic essence has not merely survived. It has gorged upon the daily sacrifice of 1,000 unsanctioned psykers. It has been magnified beyond mortal comprehension by the fanatical, dogmatic worship of countless trillions of souls across 1,000,000 desperate worlds. His spirit is now a compressed star of psychic fury, trapped within a decaying shell that violently resists its own demise. The radical hope demands that this physical shell must be deliberately shattered. They believe that by unplugging the Golden Throne, by allowing the biological corpse of the Emperor to finally wither and perish, his shackled soul will be unleashed into the Empyrean. This forbidden concept introduces the ultimate salvation, the birth of a god of order. According to this optimistic heresy, his liberated essence will not dissipate into the shrieking gales of the warp. Instead, it will violently coalesce, detonating into existence as a true and benevolent deity of staggering majesty. He would rise as a divine sovereign of the immaterium, capable of fighting the 4 chaos gods on equal footing. The ruinous powers would at last face a supreme predator, born of pure human devotion. This entity of absolute incandescent law would surge through the sea of souls to cleanse the realm of its primordial madness. Under the aegis of this new god of order, the turbulent tides of the warp would be violently tamed. Humanity would not merely survive the encroaching darkness, but be resurrected into a transcendent golden age of psychic ascendance, guided by a father who has finally cast off the frailties of flesh. It is a vision of absolute, intoxicating glory. It is a grand gamble that requires the total annihilation of terror and the temporary collapse of the imperial war machine to achieve. These secret masters are entirely willing to risk the total extinction of our species for the slimmest chance at eternal salvation. They pray in the dark for the Emperor to die, so that he might truly live and save them all. Yet in their desperate yearning for a benevolent savior, these radical minds blind themselves to the merciless nature of the warp. They willfully forget the cosmic horrors that dwell within the dark, and what kind of entity is truly born from 10 millennia of unceasing agony and fanatical blood sacrifice. Cling to the myth of the Star Child if you must. Let that fragile ember of hope warm you against the encroaching night. But the most forbidden prophecies locked within the deepest vaults of the Ordo Malleus know the deeper, soul-crushing truth. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has not just been anchored to the Golden Throne, he has been gorging on the psychic resonance of a galaxy consumed by war. Every prayer screamed by a dying guardsman feeds him. Every heretic burned in his name adds to his swelling mass. Every drop of blood shed in the fanatic zealotry of the Imperium flows directly into his warp-spanning consciousness. This is not the gestation of a benevolent savior. This is the incubation of a nightmare. If the Emperor is allowed to die, if he is permitted to finally cross the threshold of mortality and ascend within the immaterium, he will not become a god of salvation. He will become the apotheosis of ruin. The ancient texts whisper a name that terrifies even the demons of the warp, the Dark King. He would be born as the 5th chaos god, a boundless entity of absolute tyranny, subjugation, and ruin. The Emperor has absorbed too much pain and too much endless slaughter to manifest as anything else. His divine essence is saturated with the cruel, unyielding dogma of the Inquisition and the blind hatred of 10 millennia. Should the Golden Throne finally fail, his ascension would not bring peace. It would trigger a birth scream echoing the cataclysm that birthed Slaanesh. Just as the fall of the Eldari ripped the Eye of Terror into existence, the birth of the Dark King would shatter the material realm entirely. The psychic shockwave would instantly rip the souls from every human across 1,000,000 worlds. Humanity would not be saved. It would be utterly consumed, reduced to fuel for a god of eternal oppression. This is the ultimate horrifying truth of our existence. The rotting, failing status quo of the Imperium is not a tragedy waiting to be fixed. It is the absolute best-case scenario. The Golden Throne is not a prison keeping the Emperor from saving us. It is the only chain holding back our absolute annihilation. He cannot be allowed to heal, and he cannot be allowed to die. He must remain trapped in the rotting shell of his mortal corpse. He must sit upon that agonizing mechanism, screaming in the dark, forever. There is no glorious dawn waiting at the end of this millennium. There is only the grinding gears of a dying empire, sustained by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psykers. The Emperor must endure endless, unimaginable torment so that the species might draw breath for one more day. Humanity must suffer eternally in the suffocating grip of stagnation, for the only alternative is the Dark King. We are damned to this twilight of agony, forever listening to the endless shrieks of the choir, echoing into the eternal void.